about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. Now you will not be surprised that today we are talking about soils and bioretention. It's been a fairly consistent theme over a bunch of our recent episodes, but today we have a guest with us. Today we have Dale Brown. So Dale, welcome along.
Hi, Jake. How you going?
Yeah, I am good. What about you?
Yeah, good, thanks.
So I'll give you a moment in a second, Dale, to introduce yourself. But for people watching, context is soils and bioretention. We've talked about this quite a bit on Ideanthro recently. If you go back to some of our earlier episodes like Fine Balance and Fine Balance 2, talking about fine sediment in bioretention medias, trying to make them better and more hospitable for plants to grow in. Some of our more recent episodes, observing worms and other bioturbators in bioretention. I've been really dwelling on this theme of how do we make bioretention soils more hospitable for plants, because they're super important in this. And after I published that episode a few months ago called Fine Balance, you reached out to me, Dale, and essentially said, hey, I've been thinking about this as well. Let's have a chat. We finally made the chance to do it. So, before we get into it, why don't you tell me a little bit about who you are, so we've got some context, and then let's get into what have you been seeing as you've been thinking about bioretention soils and plant survival.
Yeah. Okay, Jack. Well, obviously, my name's Dale, and I work for E2 Design Labs. So, I guess I started out this journey of WSID doing music modelling for Melbourne Water many years ago. Moved through design, and now we're starting to look at a few things that have been built and maintenance, and trying to understand how things are actually working out in the field. Now we've got some to look at. So this area of bioretention and plant growth and soil moisture has been, a growing interest of mine in recent times too, similar to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, just before we started filming, you were saying to me, look, over the past couple of years, you've had the opportunity to go out and I suppose like audit or look at a range of bioretention systems for a number of different councils in Victoria. And you've been spotting, some stuff that's not going so well with plants down there. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so as you said, we've been fortunate to work with a few councils doing audits of their bioretention systems, and I guess there's a couple of consistent themes have been emerging, and one of them is it's horrified me a little, I have to admit, just how many bioretention systems we see, which the whole point is that it's a planted filter media system, and just how many of them either don't have any plants in them at all, or they've hardly got any, or the plants are just doing pretty well terribly. Which is a bit concerning, because that's the whole point of these systems, is to have plants and doing the chemical and biological treatment and so forth. So I guess where some of this all started for us is we did a project with Port Phillip looking at some of their bioretention systems, and we started to see a theme emerging, and what we saw is that basically systems where they had a bit more catchment, where they had a bit of sediment accumulated in them, where some of the species were maybe drier species like Lamandra, we saw things were generally doing okay. And then we saw the opposite, where the catchments were a bit smaller, where maybe the water wasn't getting through from the inlet, where they were being a bit more aggressive or adventurous with their species choices, where maybe people were combining a fairly sandy media with fairly shallow depth or something like that, sort of pushing all the guidelines to their max. What we saw is that the plants aren't doing well. And we could literally stand on one side of a street and there was bioretention with no plants in it at all. We walked to the other side of a street. This system had another 200 ml of filter media and the plants were all going great guns. Like it was that stark, the contrast in some of these systems.
Gotcha.
So
okay, so you started thinking it's soil moisture is one problem that's causing this, or that's one that caught your attention?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it's worth saying that problems with WSID systems are never simple or straightforward. They're always a complex myriad of issues. There's establishment, there's, did they get things in there and right in the first place? Have you had a really bad summer? Have the maintenance guys come and sprayed it all with herbicide? There's lots of other problems, but what we're seeing is that soil moisture is emerging as probably the single most consistent theme that is contributing to the demise of plants in bioretention systems.
Yep.
Across different councils, I should add. Within certain councils, we're actually seeing some other problems like no extended detention depth, but then that also causes lack of water, and you start to see similar problems. So.
Gotcha. And so this sounds very similar to things, obviously, I've experienced in Queensland, things I've seen travelling in the other states, in Adelaide, in Sydney, and the like. What I find interesting is you've started to dig into, so for the systems that you are designing and specifying, some thoughts to how to change the spec. So you as a designer going, look, I don't want just the standard media in there. I'm going to try and improve this without having any accidental inappropriate consequences, because there are some that things can go wrong.
There's a few challenges and risks there. So it's probably worth saying that, we've got the FORB and now the CRC guidelines, and they've served us well, and they've been in place for 10 years or something like that. And they're a good basis for biofilter media. There's a whole heap of things, as you said, you're trying to balance. You need a good infiltration rate. You need not too many nutrients so it doesn't leach. And the CRC are really scared about having soils that leach nutrients for good reason. There's thousands of experiments worldwide that have got systems that leach because they put too much compost in or whatever. So they're understandably nervous about that. Then you're trying to balance that. You want enough soil moisture holding capacity to support the plants. You need a stable soil, so you can't throw in, a bit of sand and a bit of clay and a bit of this and a bit of that. You actually have to get a stable, well-graded mix through that so that everything actually holds together. So there's a few different things you're trying to hit. What we're seeing in Victoria is that the FORB range for hydraulic conductivity, for example, is 100 to 300 mil an hour. What we consistently get from our suppliers here is stuff that's between 300 and 400 mil an hour every time, because they supply the same stuff from the quarry, and that's what we get. And then the soil testers look at it and they go, well, hydraulic conductivity, you're lucky if you're plus or minus 50%. That's good enough. But the problem is that we actually probably really want stuff that's more like 100 or 150 mil an hour, and we're not getting it. We're never seeing that. It's always at the top end. And it's not a direct comparison, but what you generally see as a higher hydraulic conductivity translates to a lower soil moisture content. So if we've got a lower hydraulic conductivity, you'll tend to also have more fines in it to achieve that. Then you'll have a higher soil moisture holding capacity. So
because it's not. It's not a dead straightforward comparison, because you can think about something like potting mix that you might, grow a hanging basket, put in a hanging basket or something. That actually holds a surprising amount of water, and if you've ever filled up a hanging basket, it drains straight through. So it doesn't always correlate, but it often can.
1 to 1. Yeah. And the same goes for nutrients. Just because a soil is finer and has a lower hydraulic conductivity doesn't mean it necessarily has higher nutrients. It's just generally it tends to, because you tend to get into soils that are landscape soils with organics and other stuff that then have nutrients that might then leach and cause problems. So what we're looking for, as you've said on some of your prezos before, is that fine balance of getting hydraulic conductivity in a good range so we can infiltrate water quickly. We've got soil moisture, so it's enough to keep the plants going when we get 3 weeks with no rain, which has happened a couple of times recently here in Melbourne. And at the same time, we've got the low nutrients, but we've still got some nutrients for the plants, and we've got cation exchange capacity and all those other chemical properties that we need to actually remove pollutants. So we're trying to balance a whole heap of things, and it's not easy. So in trying to move towards that, what we've done is two things with the FORB specs. The first is we've said we want the hydraulic conductivity between 100 and 200 mil an hour, and it has to be in that range. We're not accepting anything outside those ranges, so no 300 or whatever. Secondly, we're saying what we're really lacking in the specs at the moment is any requirement around soil moisture. At the moment, the spec is silent on what soil moisture. We've looked at what's coming in, and it's typically around 12 to 15%. So we've said we want minimum of 15% soil moisture holding capacity, and that's at optimum root zone depth. There's a few other things that have to be done to calculate that. And secondly, we've got an aspirational there of 20%. Now, most materials we're using probably won't get to that, but that's where we'd like to be. And essentially what that means is that you've got in the order of a quarter more water in the system than is currently available in bioretention systems. So that's a lot of extra water to help the plants go.
So when you talk percentages in there and you talk about water holding capacity, just so we're specific about the exact measurement, are you talking about available water? So are we talking about the difference between field capacity and wilting point? Is that the Is that what you're
Yeah,
specifying, or is it something different?
that's really what's important is the plant available water holding capacity. What we're specifying is a measure we've got from the soil testers, which is volumetric water content at what they call optimal root zone depth.
Okay.
So they take account of a certain root zone depth and so forth. We've adopted that just because it was easy to get test results from the soil testers and they knew how to do it. I'd like to get into plant available and have a better requirement around that, but getting analysis and results has not been that easy. So
it's interesting that you say that, because a Griffith University student, Callan Murray, has recently been doing some testing of the filter media from existing systems. So 6, but really 5, because one of them's got a history. So 5 systems. He's been taking samples out of those and trying to calculate that available water. And one of the things is it's easy. Let me get this. Which way does this go? It's easy to do. Okay, one of field capacity or wilting point, I've forgotten which one, is like a day test. Like it takes like a day under suction, works fine. The other one with the methodology he's got takes like 9 days under suction. So it's it's unsurprising that labs might not be so keen to do that, at least at a reasonable fee.
Tests. Yeah. So we've been getting soil moisture retention curves done, so we can see the range of the saturation curve as it changes with different pressures, so you can get a feel for what the plants can access and how much of the water is within that accessible range and how much is either side of it, essentially. Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was going to say, just for context for people, what we're really talking about here, if someone's listening to this and going, I haven't done soil science before, what are they on about? It's really a case of wilting point is essentially the pressure where plants pull water out of the soil using suction. So wilting point is the suction, the amount of pressure above which plants just can't exert enough pressure to get it out. So if any moisture that's held like past wilting point might be in the soil, but plants just don't have enough strength to pull it out. And it varies between species, some are better than others. And then field capacity is essentially the amount of suction that gravity applies on the soil. So how much will drain out freely. So if you got a bucket of soil with a hole in the bottom, you filled it up with water, you let it drain for like a day, let's say, and there was some water left in it, that's essentially field capacity. It's the difference between the field capacity and the wilting point that suggests what water a plant might actually be able to access. So ideally you want a soil that has a big amount of water in that range. Sands drain out super freely, so only have a little bit. Clays hold heaps of water, but they also hold a lot of it with too much suction for the plants to get to.
Yep.
Go on. Sorry, I just wanted to provide that context.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, no, that's a good summary just for the layman. I forget that not everyone has to deal with this stuff all the time.
And I think about this all the time, and I'm still scratching my head, and I'm like, which one's which? So.
Yeah, totally understand. I'm still struggling to get my head around some of it sometimes, I think.
Yeah. So I guess go on.
So that's where we're at now. That's all well and good to put these tighter specs out. What we've had happen to us 2 or 3 times is that we put these out, and contractors and suppliers come back to us with what they've always done. Often they don't even read the specs that we give them, and we have to sort of go back and say, hang on a minute, we're actually asking for something a bit different here. And so we put our foot down with our last project we're doing and said, hang on, this isn't what we want. This that we've asked for is actually what we're looking for. Can you try and do that? And they came back to us and said, well, we've got some turf sand, maybe that'll work. And so we're doing some further testing of that now. So far it's looking promising, but we'll see what comes of that. My expectation is at some point we'll have to start blending or mixing some of the materials they've got to try and get the ideal outcomes, but it already looks like it will probably be better than what we've been using, and they've got that sitting on the shelf ready to go. So if we can use something that's better and it's still giving us all the infiltration and the nutrient results that we want, then why not? So we'll see how we go.
So do you have any gut feelings of what, like, ultimately what they might, compared to a current full spec media, what physically might need to change? Like, so my current opinion, and I'll very openly admit that over the past 3 or 4 years, my opinion on this has changed, because I used to feel that we just needed more inorganic fine particles, and I've come to believe that that's a little bit off. And I now feel that a media that has some more inorganic fine particles and some more stable and recalcitrant carbon sources, i.e. stable and recalcitrant organic matter, is probably what needs to be added to the full media. But do you have any feelings of what you think that change might need to be?
Yeah, probably coming from the same page. I think as a starting point, let's have more inorganic fines. So let's have less coarse sand and gravel and that end of the spectrum, and have more fine sand and, dare I say it, a little bit more silt and clay.
Yep.
In the right balances. Getting that and keeping your infiltration rates up is of course hard, because we know that your infiltration rate and hydraulic conductivity is extremely sensitive to that silt and clay fraction and how that mixes and works through the rest of it.
Yep.
But it's worth remembering where all this comes from. Bioretention is about biomimicry. It's about looking around and saying, well, the rain falls on the soil, plants grow, the water runs through that soil and it's filtered and it evapotranspires. How does all that work? Let's build a system that's microcosm, scaled down. We've got a big area that doesn't do any of that impervious urban area, run it into a small area and try and make an efficient version of a natural soil.
Yeah.
That's where all this is coming from. So I think the closer we can get to mimicking a soil, but still having some of those more freely draining properties to handle the extra water that's coming in and so forth, the better we're going to do. So if we can have something that's got some organics, some fine inorganics, etc., but still isn't leaching nutrients, which is our big problem, then I think we're going to do better. So I think ultimately the other issue there is that we tend to be overly ambitious with our bioretention systems. We've got them down to 1 or 2% of catchment. Music is letting us put them down to 0.6% of catchment now in Melbourne, which I personally think is ridiculous, but that's what the modelling is letting us get away with. People are running around with high rate infiltration systems that are 10 times smaller than a bioretention system. I think we're actually going the wrong way. What we want is to do the opposite and say, well, actually we want to make it 5% of catchment, but now we're going to have something that's closer to a real soil. We can have a landscapey sort of soil, we can have grass and veg, but we can also put some trees in it. And then look, we've actually got some canopy cover, we're getting some other benefits. So maybe we can turn it into a garden and a veggie garden, and then, hey, well, 5% of catchment doesn't seem so bad if it's actually half of our backyard, rather than this horrible thing in the corner that we don't want to think about and we want to make it as small as we possibly can. So part of it's just reframing that discussion and the way we go about thinking about the design and the way we go about thinking about bioretention as a part of our urban landscape, really.
That's an interesting observation, that the more that we kind of try and specialize and strip out the absolute, to the nth degree of specializing this as bioretention, the more that it means that it can't do anything else, and kind of separates it and makes it less likely to be able to integrate with other spaces. Because something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I've probably, by the time we release this video, we'll probably have released another. I've been processing this under the terminology of zero additional effort water sensitive urban design. So we've all heard of Manningham City Council's zero additional maintenance water. Then trying to transition this to zero additional effort water sensitive urban design, where we go, look, what would we have done here anyway? How do we make that water sensitive? And if we have, a bioretention system is much more like a standard garden or a veggie garden or the like, I suspect it's a lot easier to add it into that zero additional effort concept. But if it's this very separate engineered structure, then it's much more of a jump to then go, how do we turn it into a garden that's actually nice and functional? And that ties in well. Is there any other angles from your point of view that we should touch off on here?
I guess a related topic on that is around the issue of clogging, and that was my PhD research, was infiltration systems and clogging, but it's probably worth touching on clogging and bioretention systems. In the audits that we've done, and we were very afraid of clogging in the early days. We'd seen some horror stories from the US where 60% of systems had failed and blah blah. We're still seeing systems here that have failed, but I would say not even 10% of the systems we've gone and looked at had clogging issues or sedimentation issues. It really isn't occurring widely for smaller scale streetscape systems. Where we are seeing issues is ones like where you've got a really large system in a greenfield subdivision. Then, of course, you've got huge sediment loads because soil's being moved around. We saw one that basically had become a pond because so much sediment had been washed in that it was no longer functioning as a bioretention. But that was also a no-brainer that, well, this is a greenfield subdivision. It's a sediment basin until the subdivision's finished. And then you come and clean it out, and then you have a bioretention system. But you can't expect a bioretention system to work with those kind of sediment loads coming in.
Yeah, and this fits exactly with my observations. I've seen plenty of bioretention systems clog up from construction phase sediment. There's no doubt that's a problem.
Yeah.
But I honestly can't say I've ever seen a bioretention system that didn't get damaged by construction phase sediment subsequently clog up from
with
other sediment that had come. Like, I have never seen it, and that extends to a couple of examples here. For example, Belle Vista on the Sunshine Coast, one of these early examples of water-sensitive urban design. One of our more recent episodes, we spoke with Malcolm Eady out there. That system was installed with really quite high inorganic fine, like really high inorganic fine content on it. And it has now lasted the best part of a decade. Those systems in the ground without clogging up. Maybe they've slowed down draining, but more than that. For various reasons, and we've addressed this in other videos as well, a bunch of the plants in the filter media died in those systems, and they still didn't clog up. Like, if there was a site that was asking to be clogged, Belle Vista, after the plants got accidentally killed, was probably the one.
That's right. And
go on.
So not to say that clogging isn't a risk, but the other thing with clogging that people often think, if we do a filter media that's got a high hydraulic conductivity, it'll reduce the risk of clogging because it's got a high infiltration rate, and then it's got further to go before it gets low. What they forget in that is that if you use a higher infiltration rate, you might then say, well, we can make our system smaller. Now, the smaller you make your system, the higher your sediment loading rate will be, the more sediment per square metre of bioretention system. So if you're going to use a higher infiltration rate, sure, you can use that, but when you model a system and design it, you have to stick to the lower infiltration rate. So you're modelling and designing on 100 mil an hour, whether you're putting the meter in at 200 or 300 mil an hour. So that doesn't change. If you do change that, you're basically saying, well, okay, we're going to double our infiltration rate. We're also going to double our sediment loading rate. And it's not linear, but roughly speaking, we're going to say the system will clog in half the time. The smaller you make your system, the faster it will clog. And if you do make them 0.5% of catchment or less, I'm quite sure that we will start seeing systems clogging up and failing through clogging failure.
Because this is...
At 1 or 2%, we get away with it down in Melbourne. And
well, because this is... One way to look at this is essentially a balance of rates. So on the one hand, you do have sediment coming in and slowly accumulating the system, which has this clogging effect. But then we have a whole bunch of other factors balancing it out, such as plant growth and root growth, the active bioturbators like worms in the soil, that are counteracting that. So what we're really saying here is that the sediment inflow rate, if you have the same size of catchment, the amount of sediment that comes in, that rate is going to be the same. But as you shrink the system down, because you have less filter media, you have less of it being unclogged by plants, less of the bioturbation of the worms, so that rate decreases. So the balance of the rate of clogging versus the rate of unclogging goes out of whack.
That's right.
And so that's why it can also be a matter of time. It's not necessarily going to say that it would happen immediately, but it might happen in a year or 2 years or down the track. Hey, you said something to me via email way back when we first touched base about this, along the lines of, and tell me if I'm misquoting you here, but something like, and people tend to forget that one of the considerations for picking soil filter media particle sizes was to try and mimic the particle sizes of runoff, because that stops clogging. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so back in the early days, and I'm hearing this secondhand from others obviously, but back in the early days when they were deciding what material to put in bioretention, the thinking was, well, what material do we actually see in sediment? And so they looked at what sort of materials you typically see in urban sediments, and funnily enough, what you see in typical urban sediments not too different to what we put in our gardens, sort of sandy loam materials, because let's face it, that's what's being washed off most urban gardens. Of course, yes, it is influenced by catchment. We like to say, well, it tends to be similar across catchments because we're importing the same material on the top. But if you've got a clay catchment, there will be some differences to a sandy catchment. Port Phillip, as a case in point, it's really sandy and coastal. You can see the evidence of that in what comes out. But the idea was that if the bioretention media is similar to what's being washed in, then you won't have a huge clogging effect because we're designing it to handle those infiltration rates for that material, and what's coming in isn't going to be changing things fundamentally or drastically, so then you won't get a clogging effect. If we start using really coarse sands and then you put in some sandy loam catchment sediment on top of that, you're then changing that character of the soil and the infiltration rate through it. So then you'll get a difference and then you'll get a clogging effect. So the idea is basically try and use something as close to what's in your catchment now as you can, because if you're doing that, then you're less likely to have clogging problems down the track.
Yeah, so you essentially by deciding to use something like what's in the catchment, you then try and design a system that will work in that situation, and the catchment runoff shouldn't change that over time, so it shouldn't have to adapt.
That's right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And of course it's not perfectly clear cut because we're trying to get high infiltration rates through those systems, and you probably want something a bit more freely draining than the clays you get in some catchments. So
that makes sense.
But that's generally what we're aiming for, and that was the thinking behind it fundamentally from the outset. So
cool, I like it. Okay, do you have any final thoughts we should touch off on there? I think there's been a bunch for people to think about, but any final thoughts?
I guess just that, firstly, that we need to continue to use what we've got. You don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, as it were. We've still got some really good standards out there. It's now time for the industry to think about refining and further evolving and developing them, and how do we improve what we're doing so that we actually get better outcomes. And it's time to start critically looking at what is actually coming out of what we do, not just continuing to do the same thing and make the same mistakes. So, I guess those 2 points.
Yeah, and this is a situation where everyone can have a hand in that. Like, the reason we're having this chat fundamentally is because you've seen a problem, and then now in your particular, in the jobs that you're working on, you're testing out some ideas. This is exactly how the standards came to be in the first place, right? There weren't standards, but people wanted to develop and implement this concept of bioretention. So they built the best systems they thought they could at the time. They looked at what worked and they wrote a standard. Well, essentially, this is a continuation of that, right? We look at the current standard, look at what we're currently doing. Someone needs to go and try and do something a little different or a little better. See what happens, report back, change it. And anyone can have that crack. Sure, it can be harder if you're doing it through a DA, right? Because you might have to convince the approving authority to let you do it. But it is still possible. And certainly if you're doing works on either private sites or works directly for a council, it's there's real opportunities to just to push the limits and try stuff that's a little different. Cool. Okay, well, Dale, thank you for taking the time to have a chat. I really appreciate it. It's you've raised some stuff that we haven't previously been able to touch on Ideanthro, stumbling on my words, so I appreciate it. I will let you get back to your Friday and get back to being pulled in several different directions already. But enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.
No worries. Thanks very much, Jack.
Cool. See you, mate.
See you later.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro, improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.